The letter that was never meant to be read. The silence that lasted 17 years. She never cried on camera, never broke down, never lost control. For nearly 2 decades, she was the face of composed grief. But then, she did something no one expected. She wrote a letter. 12 pages, handwritten in fading purple ink. And in it, she said what she had never said before. I know what happened that night. This letter wasn't sent to the police. It wasn't sent to the press. It was sent to one man, a forensic psychologist bound by a code of silence. No legal weight, no public record, just a confession wrapped in paper, sealed with guilt. I know she is dead. 3 words. One truth. 17 years too late. What really happened in that room? And why is the answer locked in a drawer that will never be opened? We are about to unravel the most explosive secret of the century. But before we break the seal, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because the story you are about to hear changes everything. The silence in the office was not empty. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that accumulates over decades, built layer by layer from the secrets of others. Dr. Aris sat behind his mahogany desk, the surface of which was uncluttered, save for a single, thick envelope that had arrived with the morning post. The rest of the mail bills, journals, invitations to conferences had been pushed aside, irrelevant and mundane. But this envelope remained in the center of his vision, demanding attention, radiating a gravity that seemed to warp the air around it. He had not touched it yet. He had simply stared at it for the better part of an hour. There was no return address scrolled in the upper corner, no indication of the sender, but deep in his gut, he knew. He knew the handwriting, even though he had only ever seen it on television screens or printed in newspapers. It was familiar in the way a famous painting is familiar, recognized instantly by millions, yet strange to see in reality, resting on his private desk. The script was looped and precise, though there was a tremor in the downward strokes that suggested the hand holding the pen had been fighting against a great internal weight. For nearly 2 decades, the world had been filled with noise regarding this case. It was a cacophony of accusations, theories, documentaries, and desperate pleas. The noise had crossed oceans and borders, filling living rooms and police stations alike. But here, in this room, there was only the terrifying quiet of an answer arriving long after the question had been shouted into the void. Aris adjusted his glasses, his own hands feeling suddenly cold, despite the controlled temperature of the room. He was a man bound by oaths. People came to him to unburden themselves of sins that the law would punish but the soul could not carry. He was a repository for guilt, a human vault designed to hold the darkest parts of the human condition. He had heard confessions of infidelity, of theft, of hatred so pure it frightened him. But this felt different. The thickness of the envelope suggested length. This was not a brief note. This was a manuscript. This was a story. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches above the paper. The envelope was made of high-quality stock, cream-colored and opaque. It felt substantial, almost like a physical object rather than a vessel for words. He wondered why it had come to him. He had never met her. He had never treated her family. He was an observer, just like the billions of others who had watched the tragedy unfold from a distance. But perhaps that was exactly why he had been chosen. He was a stranger, with a reputation for silence. He was a final repository for a truth that had nowhere else to go. The clock on the wall ticked, a rhythmic, mocking sound that marked the passing of seconds. 17 years. That was how long the silence had really lasted. 17 years of speculation. 17 years of a mother's face remaining composed, stoic, and unreadable. The world had analyzed every micro-expression, every blink, every pause in her voice, looking for a crack in the armor. They had found nothing but a wall of grief. But looking at the envelope, Aris suspected the wall had finally crumbled. Not in front of the cameras, not in a courtroom, but here, in ink and paper, sent to a man who could do nothing but listen. He picked up the letter opener, a silver blade that felt too sharp, too aggressive for the delicate task at hand. His heart hammered against his ribs, a physical reaction that annoyed him. He was a professional. He was trained to remain detached. Yet, He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to step off into a void that had consumed countless lives before him. If he opened this, he could never unlearn what was inside. There was a safety in ignorance. As long as the seal remained unbroken, the girl was simply missing. She was a ghost, a possibility, a mystery. But the moment he sliced through the paper, the mystery would die, replaced by a reality that might be far uglier than any theory the public had concocted. He thought about the police, the detectives who had spent careers chasing shadows. He thought about the journalists who had built fortunes on headlines. None of them had this. The truth had bypassed the entire machinery of justice and landed on a wooden desk in a quiet office. It was an act of subversion. It was a final act of control from a woman who had been accused of losing it. Aris took a breath, holding it in his lungs as if to steady his nerves. He slid the silver blade under the flap of the envelope. The sound of the paper tearing was sharp and loud, like a bone snapping in a quiet room. It was irreversible. The seal was broken. The sanctuary of the envelope was breached. He set the opener down and reached inside. His fingers brushed against the paper within. It felt dry, textured. He pulled the contents out slowly. 12 pages. They were dense with writing. The ink was purple, a strange, jarring choice that reminded him of bruised fruit or old veins. It was fading slightly, as if the pen had been running out of life as the words poured onto the page. The handwriting started neatly at the top of the first page but seemed to deteriorate as his eyes scanned down, becoming more erratic, more desperate. It was the writing of someone writing in the dark, or through tears, or with a hand that could no longer keep still. He did not read the middle. He did not skip to the end. He forced his eyes to the very top of the first page, to the salutation that was absent, replaced immediately by a sentence that seemed to scream from the paper. He sat back in his chair, the pages trembling slightly in his grip. The world outside the window continued its chaotic spin. Cars moved, people argued, the sun rose and fell. But in this room, time had stopped. The 17 years of noise had been silenced by the rustle of paper. He was no longer just a psychologist. He was the sole witness to a confession that would never see a courtroom. Aris looked at the first line again. The purple ink seemed to pulse. He realized then that he wasn't holding evidence. He was holding a ghost, and the ghost was finally ready to speak. He adjusted his glasses one last time, exhaled the breath he had been holding, and began to read. The ink was not black, nor was it the standard authoritative blue of a legal document. It was purple. It was a shade that reminded Aris of old bruises or the velvet lining of a jewelry box, something intimate, something hidden. The choice of color felt significant, almost like a violation of the gravity of the content. A confession of this magnitude should have been written in charcoal or blood, not in the whimsical tone of a child's school pen, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps it was the only pen she could find in the moment of her breaking, or perhaps it was a deliberate choice to soften the blow of the words that followed. Aris traced the loops of the letters with his gaze. The handwriting at the top of the first page was disciplined. The vertical lines were straight, the spacing even, the curvature of the vowels perfectly round. It was the handwriting of the woman the world had seen on television for 17 years, composed, educated, and rigidly controlled. But as his eyes traveled down the page, the discipline began to fracture. The letters started to lean aggressively to the right. The spacing became erratic, words crashing into one another as if the thoughts were arriving faster than her hand could record them. By the bottom of the page, the ink was lighter, the pressure on the pen uneven, betraying a hand that was shaking violently. He read the first sentence again, the 3 words that dismantled nearly 2 decades of global sympathy. I know she is gone. It was the certainty of the statement that chilled him. For 17 years, the public narrative had been built on the foundation of hope. She had used words like believe, search, pray, and hope. She had stood before cameras and spoken of the possibility of a reunion. She had allowed artists to age-progress photos of her daughter, creating a phantom future for one who had no future. But here, in the privacy of this letter, the vocabulary of hope was entirely absent. There was no I fear or I worry. There was only the cold, hard concrete of knowledge. Aris felt a wave of nausea. The deception was not just a lie. It was a sustained performance art piece. To look into a camera and beg for help, finding someone you knew was already beyond help, required a level of psychological compartmentalization that bordered on pathology. It meant that every interview was a script, every plea was a calculated maneuver, and every tear was, in some sense, a fabrication. He turned his attention back to the text. She described the ink itself in the second paragraph. She wrote that she had bought the pen days before the incident, a trivial purchase that had somehow survived the years. She wrote that she chose purple because it felt less official, less like a police statement. She wanted this to be a letter from a mother, not a suspect. But as Aris read on, he realized that the distinction was meaningless. A mother and a suspect could be the same person. The letter detailed the silence of her home now. She wrote about how the quiet of an empty house is different from the quiet of a house holding a secret. She described the way the truth had sat in her throat for thousands of days, a solid object that she could neither swallow nor spit out. She wrote that the ink was fading as she wrote, the pen running dry, and she took this as a sign that the story had to be told before the means to tell it disappeared completely. Aris could feel the desperation in the pressure marks on the paper. In some places, the pen had pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the fiber. In others, the line was barely a whisper. It was a physical map of her anxiety. She was terrified, not of the police, she wrote, but of the finality of writing it down. As long as the truth remained in her head, it was fluid. It could be reshaped, denied, or ignored. But once it was on paper, sent to a man like Aris, it became history. It became real. The narrative shifted abruptly. The second page did not contain apologies or justifications. It plunged directly into the memory that had been replayed in her mind every night since that spring evening. She did not describe the resort or the town. She described the room. She wrote of the stillness. It was the kind of silence that only exists when children are deeply asleep. She described the layout of the furniture with the precision of a crime scene investigator. The beds, the window, and the large sofa that sat against the far wall. There was a gap, she wrote, a narrow space between the back of the sofa and the plaster of the wall. It was a space no adult would notice, but to a smaller frame, it was a canyon, a fort, a place to explore. Aris read as she reconstructed the timeline. She was not there when it happened, but she had replayed the physics of it 1,000 times in her nightmares. She had woken up, disoriented, perhaps looking for her parents, or perhaps just playing a game of her own invention. She had climbed onto the back of the sofa. She was agile, active, a climber by nature. The letter described the slip. It was not a violent fall. It was a quiet stumble. She lost her footing on the soft fabric and slid backward. She fell into the gap. Aris felt his chest tighten as he read the clinical description of what followed. It was an accident of geometry and anatomy. The victim fell feet first, but her chest became wedged. The space was too tight. She could not push herself up, and her feet could not find purchase on the smooth floor to push her out. Her chin was caught on the top of the sofa back, her body suspended in the narrow crevice. She wrote about the position, positional asphyxia. It is a quiet way to leave the world. There is no screaming because the chest cannot expand to draw in the air needed to scream. There is no thrashing because the body is pinned tight. There is only a silent struggle, a panic that has no voice, and then unconsciousness. She described the moment she returned to the room. She did not describe the weather outside or the sounds of the holiday complex. She described only the atmosphere of the room. It felt different. The air felt static. She checked the beds. The others were sleeping soundly. The third bed was empty. The initial thought was not tragedy, but annoyance. She assumed she had wandered out or was hiding. She looked under the beds. She looked in the wardrobe. And then she saw the fingertips. Just the small, pale tips of fingers visible along the top edge of the sofa. She wrote that she thought the victim was hiding. She spoke her name softly, telling her to come out, that it was time to sleep. There was no movement, no giggle, no rustle of fabric. She pulled the sofa away from the wall. The description here was sparse, as if the writer could not bear to put the full image into words. She described the way the form slumped when the pressure was released. She described the pallor of the skin, no longer flush with the warmth of sleep, but pale, with a shadow around the lips. She described the temperature. That was the detail that haunted the page. The skin was not cold yet, but the heat of life was gone. It was the temperature of an object, not a person. She wrote that she tried to breathe life back into her. She described the desperate, frantic rhythm of chest compressions, the force she used, causing damage in her panic. She was a doctor. She knew the mechanics of survival. But she also knew the signs of the end. The pupils were fixed. The muscles were slack. The silence in the room was absolute. The accident had happened hours ago. While the parents were dining, while they were laughing, the silence had already claimed the room. They were healers. That was the irony that dripped from every sentence on the 4th page. She and her husband were both doctors, trained to save lives, trained to react with logic and precision in the face of medical emergencies. But in that room, surrounded by the smell of stale air and the reality of the tragedy, the training warped. The letter described the arrival of the father. He entered the room to find his wife on the floor, the lifeless form in her arms. He did not need to be told. He saw the posture, the lack of rise and fall in the chest. He checked for a pulse, his fingers pressing into the small neck, searching for a flutter that was not there. This was the moment, she wrote, where 2 paths diverged. The first path was the human path. Call the police, scream for help, weep over the body, and accept the tragedy of a freak accident. The second path was the path of fear. She wrote about the speed of their thoughts. They were professionals. They understood how this looked. A loss occurred while the parents were absent. A body with bruises from the fall and potentially broken ribs from the desperate CPR. To an outsider, to a foreign police force, this would not look like a tragedy. It would look like negligence. It would look like abuse. The fear was not a slow creep. It was an explosion. They thought of their careers. They thought of their reputation in the medical community. But most of all, they thought of the other 2 siblings sleeping in the same room. If they were arrested, if they were charged with homicide or neglect, the twins would be taken away. They would lose everything. The family would be dismantled. She described the conversation. It was brief, whispered in frantic, hissed tones. They analyzed the situation like a medical case. The patient is gone. The outcome cannot be changed. Calling an ambulance now changes nothing for her, but it destroys the lives of the survivors. Aris read the justification with a heavy heart. It was a terrifyingly rational form of madness. They convinced themselves that protecting the living was more important than honoring the truth of the dead. They convinced themselves that they were victims of a cruel accident and that the world would punish them unfairly for it. The panic shifted into cold efficiency. The mother wrote that she felt a part of her soul shut down in that moment. She stopped being a mother and became a conspirator. She stopped grieving and started planning. They needed time. They needed a narrative. They decided not to call the police. Not yet. They needed a story that would make them victims, not suspects. An accident implies fault. It implies they should have been there. But an abduction makes them sympathetic. An abduction turns the negligence into a crime committed by a stranger. She wrote about the horror of that decision. She looked at her daughter, the one she had carried and loved, and saw her now as evidence. They had to hide the evidence to save themselves. The transformation was complete. The parents who had walked into the room were gone, replaced by 2 people fighting for their own survival, standing over the quiet form of the daughter who would never wake up. The plan was formed in the silence, born of panic and intellect, a plan that would deceive the world for 17 years. The letter continued, the handwriting becoming sharper, angular with the recounting of technical details. The 5th page was not an emotional confession. It was a logistical analysis. The mother wrote about the heat. It was a stifling, oppressive heat that hung over the resort town, lingering long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The temperature during the day climbed near 40 degrees, and the nights offered little relief. She wrote about the biology of the end. As doctors, they knew what heat did to organic matter. They knew the timeline of decomposition better than any layman. In that climate, in that room, nature would begin to claim the vessel within hours. The smell would arrive before the sunrise. The rigor would set in, making movement difficult. They were racing against biology itself. Aris read the detached sentences with a growing sense of unease. She described the problem as if it were a complex surgery that needed to be managed. They could not leave her in the room. If the police came with dogs, if the staff came to clean, if the smell permeated the fabric of the sofa, the accident would be discovered, and their negligence would be exposed. They needed a sanctuary. They needed a place where time stopped. The solution was in the kitchen of the apartment. She wrote about the refrigerator. It was a standard appliance, white and humming quietly in the corner of the room. It was the only place in the apartment where the temperature was controlled, where the aggressive heat of the foreign summer could not reach. She described the act of emptying it. They removed the milk, the juice, the leftovers of their holiday meals. They worked in silence, moving with the efficiency of a surgical team. Then, they placed her inside. The letter did not describe the visual. It focused on the sensation of the door closing. The click of the magnetic seal was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a coffin closing, but without the dignity of wood or ceremony. It was a cold, industrial seal. Inside, the dry, chilled air would preserve the tissue. It would buy them time 3 days, maybe 5. Enough time to create a narrative. Enough time to become victims in the eyes of the world. She wrote that she stood by the refrigerator for a long moment, her hand resting on the white metal door. Inside, the victim was suspended in the dark and the cold. Outside, the parents were sweating in the heat of their panic. It was a grotesque contrast. The refrigerator, usually a symbol of domestic normalcy, had become a temporary crypt. And it was there, standing in the kitchen, that they composed themselves for the performance that would define the rest of their lives. The script was written in seconds, but the performance would last decades. The 6th page of the letter detailed the return to the dinner table. They had to go back. If they stayed in the apartment, their friends would come looking. They had to appear normal. They had to finish their wine. They had to laugh at jokes they did not hear. She wrote about the dissociation. She felt as though she were floating above the table, looking down at a woman who looked exactly like her, wearing her clothes, speaking with her voice. This woman was smiling, nodding, and engaging in conversation, while the real version of her was screaming silently, clawing at the walls of her own mind. This was the discipline she spoke of later in interviews. It was not resilience, it was the ability to split the self in two. Then came the check, the ritual they had established with their friends. One parent would leave the table to check on the sleeping children. It was her turn. She stood up. She walked the familiar path back to the apartment. She knew what she would find. She knew the bed was empty because she had emptied it. She knew the window was open because she had opened it to stage the scene. She wrote about the walk. It was the longest walk of her life. She had to rehearse the scream. She had to rehearse the face of a mother, discovering her worst nightmare. She stood outside the door for a full minute, gathering the breath she would need to shatter the peace of the night. Then, she entered. She looked at the empty bed. She looked at the open window, and she screamed. She wrote that the scream was not entirely fake. It was a release of the terror she had been holding back. But the words she shouted were calculated. She's gone. They've taken her. Those words framed the narrative instantly. They, the phantom, they, the invisible monsters in the dark. By shouting they, she shifted the blame from the parents to an intruder. Aris read as she described the chaos that followed. The friends running from the restaurant, the staff alerting the authorities, the frantic searching under bushes and in swimming pools. She watched it all, like a director watching a play. She saw her friends weeping for her. She saw strangers joining the search. She saw the police arriving, taking notes, believing every word of her panic. She realized then the power of her position. No one suspects a grieving mother. No one looks at a woman tearing her hair out in anguish and thinks she is an architect of the scene. Her grief was the ultimate shield. The search continued for days. The police were everywhere. The media had arrived, turning the quiet resort into a global stage. But the secret remained in the cold sanctuary, hidden in the heart of the crime scene. They knew they could not leave her there. The apartment would eventually be searched thoroughly. They had to move her. The 7th page focused on the father. He was a man of logic, a man who compartmentalized his trauma. He needed a way to transport the body out of the apartment without drawing attention. He needed something common, something that belonged in a holiday resort. He chose his tennis bag. It was a large, dark sports bag, long enough to hold a racket, and spacious enough to hold the small, rigid form. The letter described the morning he made the move. It was early, the sun just beginning to burn off the mist. He dressed in his athletic gear. To the world, he was a grieving father trying to clear his head, trying to run off the stress of the investigation. She described the transfer. It was done quickly, behind closed blinds. The body, cold and stiff, was placed inside the bag. He zipped it shut. The sound of the zipper was another finality. He walked out the front door. He did not run. He walked with a steady, purposeful pace. He carried the bag over his shoulder. It was heavy, a dead weight that pulled at his muscles, but he could not show the strain. He had to look like a man carrying towels and water, not a man carrying his burden. He walked past police officers. He walked past journalists setting up their cameras. He walked past volunteers who nodded at him with sympathy. "Stay strong," one of them said. He nodded back, a mask of gratitude on his face. Aris felt the tension radiating from the page. The sheer audacity of the act was breathtaking. He was walking through the center of a manhunt with the object of the search slung over his shoulder. It was the ultimate gamble. If the zipper broke, if a police officer asked to check his gear, it would be over. But no one asked. They saw the costume, the grieving father, and they looked away, giving him space, giving him the privacy to commit the final stage of the concealment. He did not go to the tennis courts. He walked up the hill that rose behind the resort. It was a rugged patch of land, covered in scrub brush and loose earth, overlooking the town. It was a place where tourists rarely went, a patch of wilderness on the edge of the manicured vacation zone. The letter described the burial. It was not deep. The ground was hard, baked by the sun, and he had no tools other than his hands and a loose rock he found nearby. He dug a shallow trench in the shadow of a large bush. He worked frantically, sweat stinging his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was not there, but she wrote as if she were. She had visited the site later, in her mind and in reality. She described the placement of the body. There was no coffin, no shroud, just the earth claiming its own. He covered her with the soil, packing it down, scattering leaves and debris over the mound to make it look undisturbed. She wrote about the flower. It was the only ceremony they could offer. Before he left, he found a small pink flower growing nearby. He plucked it and placed it on top of the hidden grave. It was a marker, a secret coordinate, a silent apology from a father who had failed to protect her in life and was now hiding her in death. He walked back down the hill. The bag was empty now, swinging lightly at his side. He returned to the apartment, sweaty and exhausted. He told the police he had been running, searching the hills. They believed him. They praised his dedication. The letter ended this section with a reflection on that hill. For 17 years, she wrote, people had searched the ocean, the wells, the backstreets of cities across Europe. They had looked for a living girl, but all the while, she was there, just a few hundred yards from where she fell, sleeping under a pink flower that had long since withered and turned to dust. The world was looking for a complicated conspiracy, but the truth was simple, shallow, and buried in plain sight. The letter shifted from the logistical to the visceral. The neat, angular handwriting that had detailed the preservation of the body began to loop and drag again, heavy with exhaustion. The 9th page was a confession of the subconscious. She wrote about the nights. For 17 years, the world had imagined her lying awake, wondering where her daughter was, wondering if she was cold or hungry, or calling out for her mother. The public believed her nightmares were filled with kidnappers and dark vans. But the truth, she wrote, was far more static. She did not dream of a lost soul wandering the streets of a foreign city. She did not dream of phone calls or ransom notes. She dreamed of the hill. Aris read the description of these dreams. They were recurring, playing out with the reliability of a recorded tape. In the dream, she was not searching. She was standing still. She could feel the texture of the soil beneath her feet. It was dry, crumbly earth, mixed with small stones and roots. She wrote that she could feel the weight of the ground pressing down, not on her, but on the secret beneath it. She described the sensation of suffocation. In her sleep, she would often wake up gasping, her hands clawing at her own throat. The psychologist in Aris recognized this immediately. It was a transference of trauma. She knew exactly how she lay trapped first behind the sofa, and now trapped beneath the earth. The mother's mind was trying to process the physical reality of the burial by experiencing it herself. She wrote that the most terrifying part of the dream was the proximity. In the dream, she was always just a few feet away. She could reach out and touch the pink flower that marked the spot. The horror was not in the distance. The horror was in the closeness. To wake up every morning and go on television, begging the world to search across borders and oceans, while her mind remained anchored to a patch of dirt 5 minutes from where they slept. This was the fracture that had slowly broken her sanity. The letter confessed that she began to hate the hope of others. When strangers told her they were praying for a safe return, she felt a spike of rage. Their hope felt like an accusation. Their prayers were directed at someone who no longer existed. She was the only one who knew that the search was futile. Yet she had to nod and thank them, trapping herself further in the nightmare of the hill. The 10th page addressed the face she showed the world. Aris had seen this face 1,000 times. It was the face on the news, the face in the tabloids, the face that had become a global icon of stoic grief. She rarely cried in public. She never screamed. She never collapsed. The media called it dignity. They called it British resolve. They praised her for her strength. In the letter, she destroyed this compliment. It was not strength, she wrote. It was discipline. It was fear. She explained the mechanics of her composure. If she allowed herself to cry, really cry, she was terrified that she would not be able to stop, and in that unraveling, the truth might slip out. A sobbing person loses control of their breathing, their words, their thoughts. She could not afford to lose control. The mask was a survival mechanism. It was a rigid muscular effort to keep the internal scream from becoming external. She referenced a specific interview, one that Aris remembered clearly. In it, she had said, "We need to be in control." At the time, the world interpreted this as a mother trying to manage a crisis foundation. But the letter revealed the chilling double meaning. They needed to be in control of the narrative. They needed to be in control of the timeline. They needed to be in control of themselves. She wrote about the physical pain of the lies. Lying to a police officer is difficult. Lying to a journalist is stressful. But lying to the entire world, every day, for 17 years, creates a physical toxicity in the blood. She described the tension in her jaw, the constant migraine behind her eyes, the way her hands would shake the moment the cameras turned off. She admitted that there were moments she wanted to confess, just to end the performance. The energy required to maintain the fiction was greater than the energy required to face the punishment. But then she would look at her husband, and she would look at her twins. The mask would tighten again. She was not protecting herself anymore. She was protecting the lie that kept her remaining family intact. She had become an actor in a tragedy of her own writing, and the audience was too large for her to ever leave the stage. She wrote about the money. The donations had poured in from every corner of the globe. It was a tsunami of financial support. Millionaires, celebrities, and ordinary working people had opened their wallets to help find the missing girl. A fund was established. Lawyers were hired. Private detectives were dispatched to follow leads that the parents knew were dead ends. She described the nausea of signing checks. Every dollar spent on a private investigator was $1 wasted on a charade. They were paying men to look for a ghost. They were funding a search for one they had already buried. The waste was astronomical, but they could not stop it. To stop the fund, to stop the search, would be to admit that there was no hope, and to admit there was no hope would raise the question, why do you know that? But the deeper guilt, the one that stained the pages with heavy dark strokes, was about the others. She wrote about the others who went missing the same year, the year before, and the years after. She wrote about the children who were not white, not middle class, not the children of doctors. She wrote about the children whose parents did not have connections to the media, whose faces did not spark a global campaign. These children vanished into the dark, and the world stayed silent. There were no documentaries for them, no papal blessings, no concerts held in their honor. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that her lie had sucked the oxygen out of the room for everyone else. The attention economy was finite. By monopolizing the world's empathy for someone who was already gone, she had deprived living, missing souls of the resources that might have saved them. She was not just a liar. She was a thief of hope. She described sitting in her comfortable home, paid for by the careers they had saved, watching news reports about other missing children that were given 30 seconds of airtime before the news cycle returned to her daughter. She felt a profound sense of shame. She had become a symbol of victimhood, yet she was the one victimizing the invisible families who were screaming into a void that she was filling with noise. Aris put the page down, feeling the weight of the moral injury. The crime was no longer just about a concealed accident. It was about the manipulation of the world's heart. She had taken the purest human instinct, the desire to protect a loved one, and weaponized it to protect a secret. The purple ink on the page looked less like writing, and more like a stain that would never wash out. The letter now turned its gaze away from the dead, and focused with piercing intensity on the living. The 12th page was not a confession of a crime, but a confession of a slow, agonizing domestic tragedy. It was dedicated to the twins, the two children who had slept through the silence of that fateful night and had woken up to a world that had been fundamentally rewritten by their parents. She wrote about the impossible duality of her existence. For 17 years, she had been forced to inhabit two contradictory roles simultaneously. To the viewing public, she was the tragic figurehead of a global campaign, the mother of the missing soul, a woman defined entirely by loss. But inside the walls of their home, she had to be the functional mother of two growing survivors. She had to butter toast, check homework, sign permission slips, and stand on the sidelines of football matches. She wrote that this fracture in her identity was a kind of schizophrenia induced by survival. She would smile at a school achievement in the afternoon, and then, hours later, sit before a camera and speak of an enduring, hollow emptiness. The narrative of the letter explored the terrifying nature of normalcy. She described the effort it took to manufacture a normal childhood for the twins. It was a performance more exhausting than any press conference. Every birthday party they celebrated was haunted by the phantom of the birthday that was not being celebrated. Every time she counted heads in the backseat of the car, the number was wrong. The math of their family had been permanently subtracted from, yet she had to pretend the equation was balanced. She wrote with chilling candor about the shadows that lived in the house. She described the paranoia that infested her relationship with the twins. As they grew older, transitioning through the years, she watched them with a predatory vigilance. She was not looking for signs of rebellion. She was looking for signs of memory. They had been in the room that night. They had been sleeping just feet away from where the accident occurred and the subsequent cover-up began. She lived in a state of perpetual terror that the subconscious mind is a vault that never truly locks. What if a smell triggered a memory? What if the sound of a zipper or the specific heavy silence of a hot room brought the truth rushing back to them? There were moments, she wrote, where she felt they knew. She described times when the twins would look at her with a certain heaviness in their eyes, a question that hovered on their lips but was never asked. She wondered if they sensed the lie not as a fact, but as an atmosphere. Children are intuitive. They absorb the unspoken tensions of a household. She feared that they had absorbed the deceit into their very bones, growing up around a black hole that their parents refused to name. The letter admitted to a terrible, corrosive jealousy. She wrote that she sometimes found herself resenting the living for being alive when the other was not. And then, immediately, she would be consumed by a wave of guilt so powerful it made her physically ill. She was raising ghosts as much as she was raising children. She confessed that she had effectively sacrificed the emotional truth of two siblings to protect the reputation of the parents. They were the collateral damage of the lie. They had been forced to grow up in a museum of grief, their own milestones, always secondary to the search for a sibling who was never coming home. She wrote about the silence at the dinner table. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a curated silence. There were topics that were forbidden, not by decree, but by habit. The twins learned early on that their sister was a sacred subject, one that caused their mother to freeze and their father to look away. So, they learned to suppress their own questions. They learned to carry the family burden without ever being told what it weighed. She realized now, writing this letter, that she had not protected them, she had infected them. She had bequeathed them a legacy of deception that would shape their relationships with the world forever. They were the innocent guards of a prison they didn't know they were in. Aris reached the final period of the final sentence. He did not put the paper down immediately. He held the 12th page in his hand, feeling the texture of the fiber, acutely aware that he was holding the physical manifestation of a life's destruction. The room was silent, but it was a different quality of silence than before. When the morning began, the silence was empty, a blank canvas waiting for the day's work. Now, the silence was heavy, dense, and suffocating. It was crowded with the ghosts of the story he had just absorbed. He took off his glasses and placed them on the mahogany desk, rubbing the bridge of his nose where the tension had begun to throb. He was a man of science, a man who understood the architecture of the human mind. He knew that the compulsion to confess is as primal as the need to eat or sleep. The human psyche is not designed to hold a contradiction of this magnitude for a lifetime. The pressure builds. The cognitive dissonance, the gap between who we are and who we say we are, eventually demands a bridge. The letter was that bridge. But as Aris sat there, the professional analysis gave way to a personal sense of entrapment. He began to dissect the motive of the sender, not with sympathy, but with a cold realization of what she had done to him. This was not an act of surrender. It was an act of transfer. She had not written to the police. A letter to the police is a legal document. It initiates a chain of evidence, arrests, and trials. She had not written to a priest. A confession to a priest is a spiritual release, seeking absolution from a higher power. Instead, she had chosen him a forensic psychologist, a man whose entire career was built on the foundation of confidentiality and the ethical analysis of the criminal mind. She had weaponized his ethics against him. She knew that he was bound by a code that prevented him from revealing the contents of a therapy-adjacent disclosure unless there was an immediate threat to life. But there was no threat to life here. The life in question was gone, extinguished 17 years ago. The threat was to history, to justice, to the narrative concepts that did not override his professional oath. Aris stood up and walked to the window. Though he did not see the street below, he realized he was now the container for her poison. For 17 years, she had woken up every morning with the crushing weight of the truth sitting on her chest. She had carried it through interviews, through holidays, through the silence of her home, and now, with 12 pages of fading purple ink, she had lifted that weight off her own shoulders and placed it squarely onto his. She could sleep tonight, knowing that someone else knew. She was no longer the sole keeper of the hell she had created. He felt a flare of anger. It was a narcissistic confession. She did not want to face the consequences of her actions. She only wanted relief from the isolation of them. She wanted a witness, not a judge. She wanted someone to look at the intricate, horrifying architecture of her lie and acknowledge the skill it took to build it. By reading the letter, he had become her accomplice. He was now the only other citizen of her secret world. He looked back at the pages scattered on his desk. They looked so innocent, just paper and ink. Yet, they had the power to topple governments, destroy reputations, and rewrite history books. If he walked out that door and spoke the truth, the world would erupt. But if he did, he would be destroying his own life as well. His reputation, his practice, his integrity, as a keeper of secrets. She had trapped him in a perfect stalemate. He realized the cruelty of her choice. She had not given him the power to solve the case. She had given him the burden of knowing it was unsolvable. He knew where the body lay. He knew the specific geography of the hill. He knew the depth of the earth and the type of flower that once marked the spot. But he could not pick up a shovel. He could not lead a search party. He was paralyzed by the very role that made him a recipient of the truth. Aris returned to his chair and sat down heavily. The air in the room felt thin. He looked at the envelope, the handwriting, the fading ink. He realized that this was the final twist of the knife. The abduction was a lie, but the kidnapping was real. She had not been kidnapped by a stranger. The truth had been kidnapped by the parents. And now, Aris himself had been taken hostage. He was a prisoner of a story that had ended 17 years ago, yet was just beginning for him. The transfer was complete. She was free. He was bound. The 14th page of the letter did not concern itself with the past. It was a manifesto for the present. It was here, in the final movements of her confession, that the mother addressed the question that had been screaming in Aris's mind since he sliced open the envelope. Why now? And, perhaps more importantly, why him? She wrote with a clarity that was terrifying. She explained that for 17 years, she had waited for the guilt to fade. She had believed that time was a solvent, that eventually the sharp edges of the truth would wear down, and she would be able to live comfortably within the lie she had constructed. But she had discovered the opposite. Time did not erode the truth. It calcified it. The secret had become heavier, denser, a physical mass that occupied more space in her mind than her own memories. She was no longer living a life. She was merely maintaining a defense system around a memory. However, she made a distinction that chilled Aris to the bone. She wrote that while she could no longer carry the weight alone, she was not seeking justice. She devoted paragraphs to dismantling the concept of justice. To the world, she wrote, "Justice is a simple equation. A crime is committed, the truth is revealed, and the perpetrator is punished. Justice means handcuffs, courtrooms, headlines, and prison cells. It means the satisfaction of the public mob." But to her, justice was not a solution. It was an annihilation. If she were to offer herself up to the machinery of the law, she argued, it would not undo the accident. It would not bring her back from the hill. All it would do was destroy the survivors. It would take the father away from his practice and his children. It would take the mother away from the home. It would brand the innocent survivors as the offspring of monsters, scarring their futures and tainting every relationship they would ever have. She asked Aris to weigh the scales as she had. On one side, the abstract satisfaction of strangers who wanted the puzzle solved. On the other side, the tangible, breathing lives of her remaining family. She chose the family. She chose to deny the world its justice in order to preserve her own peace. This was why she had written to a therapist and not a police chief. She explained that a confession to the police is an act of surrender. It is an admission of defeat. It is handing over control of one's life to the state. But a letter to a psychologist is different. It is a therapeutic transfer. She was not asking to be judged. She was asking to be understood. She wanted a professional witness to validate the psychological logic of her survival. She wanted Aris to look at the nightmare she had lived and say, "Yes, I see why you did it." She craved validation, not absolution. She wanted someone to acknowledge that her deception was not born of malice, but of a desperate, panicked love for the living. She was trying to frame the cover-up as a maternal act of protection, twisting the morality until it fit her needs. The letter delved into the concept of the end. She wrote that a story does not end when the public loses interest. It ends when the author puts down the pen. For 17 years, the world had been trying to write the ending to her story. They wrote endings involving abductors, traffickers, and wanderings. But she was the only one with the authority to write the true ending. By sending this letter, she was writing the end. She was closing the book. She explained that she needed to externalize the truth so that she could finally forget it. As long as the secret existed only in her neurons, she had to guard it every second of every day. But now that it existed on paper, in Aris's office, it was stored outside of her body. She had effectively backed up her memory to a hard drive so that she could wipe her own mind clean. It was a purely selfish act of psychological hygiene. She wrote about the relief of knowing that the search was, in reality, over. The police would continue to search, the funds would continue to raise money, and the documentaries would continue to air. But she and now Aris knew that it was all theater. The curtain had already fallen. The play was done. The actors were just moving their mouths in silence. She addressed Aris directly in the final paragraphs of this section. She appealed to his humanity, but also to his ego. She wrote that she chose him because he was a man who understood the complexity of the human condition. She wrote that she knew he would not be so crude as to destroy a family for a truth that could save no one. She was gambling on his ethics. She was betting that his commitment to confidentiality and his understanding of trauma would outweigh his obligation to the law. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. She was trapping him in a moral gray zone. If he exposed her, he was destroying a family to solve a cold case. If he kept silent, he was an accomplice to a cover-up. She had forced him into a position where there was no right answer, only different shades of wrong. She concluded with a sentiment that hovered between tragedy and arrogance. She wrote that some truths are too heavy for the world to hold. The public wants simple monsters and innocent victims. They cannot handle the reality of good people making terrible choices in a moment of panic. Therefore, by keeping the truth from them, she was not just protecting herself. She was protecting the world from a disappointment it could not handle. She was keeping the mystery alive because the mystery was more hopeful than the answer. She was gifting the world a legend while she kept the corpse. And she was asking Aris, from one professional to another, to help her keep the legend alive. The decision did not arrive as a lightning bolt of clarity. It settled over the room like a layer of dust, gradual and inevitable. Aris sat motionless, the 12 pages of purple handwriting resting beneath his fingertips. He felt a strange vibration in his hands, a psychosomatic tremor born from the knowledge that he was touching the most dangerous object in the world. This stack of paper was not merely a confession. It was a demolition order for history. He began to run the simulations in his mind, playing out the future like a chess grandmaster, seeing 20 moves ahead. If he picked up the phone and called the authorities, what would happen? He imagined the conversation. He would speak to a desk sergeant, then a detective, then a chief. He would hand over the letter, and then the forensic analysis would begin. They would test the paper, the ink, the saliva on the seal. They might prove she wrote it, or they might not. But even if they authenticated the handwriting, what did they actually have? They had a story. They had a claim of an accident and a burial from 17 years ago. Without the body, the letter was just words. And she, the woman who had maintained a mask of iron discipline for nearly 2 decades, would simply deny it. She would claim it was a forgery, or a moment of mental breakdown, a piece of therapeutic fiction written to exorcise her demons. Her lawyers would descend like wolves. They would tear Aris apart. They would accuse him of breaching confidentiality, of seeking fame, of fabricating evidence. The media would turn its gaze on him. He would become the villain, the doctor trying to destroy a grieving mother. The search for the truth would be lost in the noise of the scandal. And if he went to the press? If he leaked the letter to the newspapers that had printed her face millions of times, the chaos would be absolute. The world would devour the story. But would they believe it? Or would it just become another theory, another layer of debris on top of the mountain of speculation? The internet would dissect every comma. Conspiracy theorists would war over the phrasing. The dignity of the truth would be stripped away, replaced by a circus of public opinion. And what of the hill? The letter gave coordinates, specific and descriptive. He could fly there. He could take a shovel and dig in the dry earth, under the scrub brush. He could find the truth himself. The thought made him nauseous. He was a man of the mind, not a gravedigger. To disturb that resting place, to drag the remains of the missing back into the flashing lights of the world, felt like a desecration greater than the concealment itself. Aris realized that the trap she had set was perfect. She had given him the truth in a format that rendered it useless. She had given him the answer, but she had stripped him of the power to prove it. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, as if the gravity in the room had increased. He picked up the pages, tapping them against the desk to straighten the edges. The sound was sharp, final. He found a manila folder, thick and unmarked. He slid the letter inside. The purple ink disappeared into the beige darkness of the folder. He walked to the heavy steel filing cabinet that stood in the corner of his office. This was not where he kept patient files. This was where he kept the things that could not be categorized. This was a purgatory for secrets that had no other home. He pulled open the bottom drawer. The metal runners groaned, a sound of protest. Inside, there were other files, other burdens he had carried for other people, but none as heavy as this. He looked at the empty space at the back of the drawer. It looked like a mouth waiting to be fed. He held the folder over the open drawer. This was the moment of commitment. Once he dropped it, he was no longer an observer. He was a participant. He was becoming the final link in the chain of silence. He was agreeing to the terms of the contract she had written. She would keep her freedom, and he would keep her ghost. He thought about the world outside. At this very moment, there were likely people on online forums discussing the case, analyzing photos, proposing theories about traffickers and boats. There were detectives reviewing cold case files, hoping for a breakthrough. There were people praying. They were all looking for something that was already here, in his hand. He felt a profound sense of sorrow, not just for the lost, but for the nature of truth itself. We are taught that the truth will set you free, that the truth always comes to light. But Aris knew, as he looked into the dark abyss of the filing cabinet, that this was a lie. Some truths are never found. Some truths are buried under hills, and others are buried in drawers. The world does not run on truth. It runs on the stories we agree to believe. He dropped the folder. It landed with a soft, dull thud. It did not sound like an explosion. It did not sound like justice. It sounded like a book closing. He pushed the drawer shut. He turned the key in the lock. The click of the mechanism was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was done. The search was over. The mystery was solved. And yet, tomorrow, the world would wake up and continue to search. They would continue to ask, "Where is she?" And Aris would sit at his desk, adjusting his glasses, listening to the silence, the only man on earth who knew that the question had already been answered. He walked back to his chair and sat down. He looked at his hands. They were empty now, but he could still feel the weight. The letter was gone, hidden away in the dark, but the ghost had moved. It was no longer haunting the mother. It was no longer haunting the hill. It was sitting in the chair across from him, invisible and eternal, waiting for a conversation that would never happen. The silence in the room was absolute, and in that silence, Aris understood that he would never be alone again.